Chapter 24 The Final Test 6 days after the plebiscite in British Togoland, on the 15th of May, the ceremonial opening of the Legislative Assembly took place. In his speech from the throne, the governor referred to the message from the Queen which he had read to the Assembly 2 years previously, in which Her Majesty had expressed her deep satisfaction that the Gold Coast had reached a step which it was intended should be the last one before the goal of independence had been reached. The governor explained to the House that when the Queen's message had been delivered, it had not been apparent that differences would arise in the country regarding the basic form of constitution under which the Gold Coast should attain independence. He went on to enumerate the number of attempts that had been made to settle these differences without success. He then referred to the Secretary of State's statement in the House of Commons the previous week, as it did not appear to the government that any useful purpose would be served by attempting to arrange further conferences on the constitutional issue in fulfillment of its aim to achieve independence for the country as soon as possible. It would submit its constitutional proposals for Gold Coast independence to be debated at the present meeting of the Assembly, and when these had been debated, it would go to the country. It will seek a mandate from the people, the governor said, that they desire the immediate grant of independence and wish these proposals, in the form finally approved by this House, to form the basis of the self-governing constitution. His Excellency informed the House that he proposed to dissolve the Assembly in due course, and that a general election would then be held. 3 days later, I moved that the Assembly should adopt the government's white paper containing its constitutional proposals for a sovereign and independent Gold Coast, and its statement on the report of the Constitutional Advisor and the report of the Achimota Conference. The white paper proposed that upon independence the country should be renamed Ghana and should be a member state of the Commonwealth. In spite of the fact that various members of the opposition parties had for many years associated themselves with the name of Ghana, and that many of their short-lived parties had included this name in the titles, they had recently attacked the idea. In my speech, I pointed out to the House that the name Ghana was rooted deeply in ancient African history, especially that of the western portion of Africa, known as the Western Sudan. It kindled in the imagination of modern West African youth, I told them, the grandeur and the achievements of a great medieval civilization which our ancestors had developed many centuries before the European penetration and subsequent domination of Africa had begun. According to the tradition, the various peoples of tribal groups in the Gold Coast were originally members of this great empire. I recalled that it was from this rich historical background that the name of Ghana had been proposed as the new name of the Gold Coast upon the attainment of independence, and that we took pride in the name, not out of romanticism, but as an inspiration for the future. Other points proposed in the white paper were that there should be a Governor-General appointed by the Queen on the advice of the Ghana government. Supreme legislative power should be vested in the Ghana Parliament, whose laws should be acts of Parliament. The life of the Parliament should be 5 years, though that of the present Assembly would remain 4 years. Ghana would become an independent sovereign state and would have full responsibility for defense and external affairs. It was proposed to set up the following regions: Eastern, Western, Ashanti, Brong, Northern, and Transvolta/Togoland, and also an independent Accra/Tema district. A regional assembly could be established by an act of parliament in any region completely covered by district councils where a majority of the district councils desired it, and in any other region where a majority of local councils desired it. Except with the consent of a majority of 2/3 of the members of Parliament, no regional assembly should be abolished or suspended, and no changes should be made in the composition or powers of a regional assembly. My motion was debated upon and passed, and on the 5th of June the governor issued two proclamations, one dissolving the Legislative Assembly and the second declaring a general election to take place on the 12th and 17th of July in the Northern Territories. 2 days were essential owing to the inaccessibility of some districts, and on the 17th of July in the rest of the country. Now that the final test in the form of a general election was about to be played out, I experienced a deep sense of satisfaction and happiness. The years of my long struggle were almost at an end, one way or the other. I felt that I had done all I could to lead the country to freedom that I had always believed it had wanted. It was now up to the chiefs and the people to say whether they desired freedom or not. The manifesto which I issued was brief and simple. I pointed out in the introduction that it was an historic document, for according to the way that the country voted, history would be made or marred. There were, I said, only two questions to ask oneself. Do I want independence in my lifetime, or do I want to revert to feudalism and imperialism? I was determined not to allow the election campaign to drift away from the issue which had provoked it, that is, a unitary versus a federal structure of government. The election was decisive in our struggle for final political freedom for Ghana, and that point must be made clear to the people. The pledge of the Secretary of State for the colonies was so absolute that he could not go back on it, and I had no doubt whatever that that pledge had been sincerely given. Yet in spite of the decisive nature of the forthcoming general election and the urgent need for discipline, cooperation and eagerness within the CPP, I experienced the same old trouble with party members trying to stand independently against official candidates. I began to feel, however, that much of this confusion was caused through misunderstanding, for I found that as soon as I went in person to speak to those concerned, they immediately showed their willingness to stand down in favor of the official candidates. The trouble was that this entailed so much extra traveling. On 2 occasions in particular, I never went to bed at all for 48 hours, and I began to wonder just how far a man of 46 could stretch his strength and energy. I began to get splitting headaches, something I had never suffered from before, and my stomach became upset. I had addressed so many rallies and gatherings that my voice had almost gone. But then the sun came out, as it always does in the end, and by the 20th of June, the final date for the registration of candidates, the party members that had been nominated to contest each of the 104 seats for the next assembly had been chosen. By the 2nd of July, 5 of these seats were already secured for us unopposed. The party entered the campaign in high spirits, and the election machine was soon working efficiently. There could be only one place to launch this momentous election campaign, that same arena in Accra, which had witnessed the birth of my party and the many decisive rallies in our long and arduous struggle. Long before my car reached the arena, dense crowds had brought it to a standstill. As soon as I recognized that there was one deafening yell of freedom, as every arm was raised in the freedom salute, before I knew what was happening, I was seized bodily and hoisted like a flag to be carried triumphantly through the excited masses until I was lowered onto the platform to join my ministerial and other party colleagues. In my speech, I emphasized the clear-cut issue which was involved in the election and warned the people not to be misled or intimidated by opposition election stunts. I mentioned in particular the reports that had lately come out from Ashanti that the ballot would not really be secret, and that by means of a photographic device a record would be made of all those who dared to put their voting papers in the box of the red cockerel, the symbol of the Convention People's Party. Now, you are intelligent people, I cried, amid the storm of indignation. It is an insult to your intelligence to spread such ridiculous stories. I then urged all those CPP members who had fled from Ashanti not to be afraid to return there to cast their votes. I reminded them that the governor, in a recent broadcast speech, had made it clear to the country that he was responsible for the maintenance of the law and of order during the election period, and that he would see that all forms of violence and intimidation at that time were kept in check. This is the end of the road, I concluded. Whether we go through the Golden Gate to freedom, or whether we remain behind, is now a matter for you to decide. You, you, and you, I shouted as I pointed to all corners of the crowd. Arms suddenly appeared. There was a roar of voices, and within seconds I was snatched from the platform and placed in an improvised sedan chair, well cushioned and shaded by a large umbrella. I experienced a slight flutter in my stomach as I took off, but once I was airborne, I discovered that it provided about the most comfortable form of transport that I had yet experienced. On one or two occasions, however, when my bearers took it into their hands to trot or to join in the rhythm of the dancers, I would have welcomed the secure embrace of a safety belt. The weeks that followed were completely taken up with electioneering in all parts of the country. Just as soon as I returned to Accra, after an extensive campaign in one part of the country, I would receive an urgent summons to support one of my candidates in another area. Some people registered their objection to the official party candidate and wanted to put up others of their choice. Time and time again, I pointed out to the people that this was no ordinary election. It was no time to bicker over personal preferences for an individual when the whole interest of the country was at stake. The outcome of the general election became the main topic of conversation at cocktail parties and social gatherings throughout the country. Although I had no time myself to attend such functions, I heard that the figure being quoted in the semi-official circles was CPP 56 NLM 48. As time went on, however, the enthusiasm with which I received throughout the country couldn't fail to leave its mark on the speculators, and one evening a friend of mine called in to see me after he had attended a large cocktail party, and had told me that one man in particular, who had previously forecast a substantially reduced majority for the CPP, was now convinced that my party would be returned with at least the same majority that we had in the last assembly. Until then, however, our campaign had been largely concentrated in areas where we knew we had the strongest support. It now became imperative that we should penetrate into Ashanti, where for nearly 18 months violence and other forms of intimidation had virtually turned the CPP into an underground movement. Because of the attacks on party members and supporters which had been made in Kumasi, it had not been considered good policy for leading party members to visit the town. This was not because we feared personally for our safety, but because we did not wish to do anything which might encourage more riots and bloodshed and invite imperialist intervention which would only postpone our independence. But this forbearance could not continue during a general election. Now on Sunday, the 1st of July, I announced to my party executive, we will hold a monster rally in Kumasi. My words were drowned in cries of jubilation. At last, they cried. At last we can show them. The enthusiasm with which my announcement was greeted throughout the rest of the country was unbounded. Reports reached me 2 days before the rally that lorry load after lorry load of people were arriving in Kumasi. It was then that I began to doubt the wisdom of a personal appearance in the capital of Ashanti at such a time. I knew well enough the reception I would receive. The people would be almost mad with excitement and would be capable of demonstrating their jubilation in a variety of ways that might cause friction with supporters of the opposition parties. I discussed the matter with the Central Committee of my party, and after a great struggle of heads against hearts, it was decided that I should not go. We chartered a plane to take the rest of the party members to the rally, and they were due to take off from Accra at 10 a.m. At about 10:30 a.m., they all arrived back at my house. seething with rage. The airline refuses to take us. They say that there is a leak in one of the petrol tanks. Is that the only plane available then? I asked, deeply disappointed. So they say. Well, you'll have to go by road. If you start now, you should arrive somewhere around 2:30 or 3 this afternoon. Without another word, they scrambled into 2 cars and were on the road. I waited anxiously for news and prayed that they would not have an accident on the way, for they were in such a hurry to arrive at Kumasi in time that I knew they would be driving at breakneck speed. They returned at about 9:30 that evening and excitedly recounted what was obviously a most successful rally. Thousands had attended, and the way things had gone left no doubt in any of their minds as to the strength of support our party still had there. Kobo Edusai, one of the members who had taken part in the rally, now one of the ministers without portfolio in the present government, came to me the following day at the party headquarters and said, "Tell me, Kwame, what sort of a man are you?" I was a bit taken aback and asked him what he meant. "I admit," he said, "that the rally in Kumasi was a huge success. But at the same time, there was something sadly lacking. When you are there, it makes so much difference, both to the crowds and to us." I was deeply touched by what he said and by the sincerity with which he spoke. But one should not wonder at that, he added, more brightly. For after all, Kwame Nkrumah is the CPP, and the CPP is Kwame Nkrumah. I have wondered since whether in fact my non-appearance in Kumasi did have an effect on the results there. Could my presence have secured, for instance, that the seat of that promising young man, J.E. Jantwa, Minister of Agriculture, in my last government? On the whole, however, I feel that the risks involved would not have justified it. As it was, there were a number of minor skirmishes that day between the police and gangs of opposition hooligans, and 2 explosions and a number of gunshots in the morning were indications in themselves of the tenseness of the atmosphere in Kumasi. As the election campaign worked towards its climax, the opposition became more and more reckless in their statements of confidence in winning the election, and equally at pains to impress upon the audience that the defeat of the CPP was already assured. In a letter to the governor, which was released for publication on the day of the election and appeared in the press the day after, Dr. Buzia began by listing in detail the organizations forming the National Liberation Movement and its allies, and the names of 17 independent candidates who he said had agreed to support these groups and to accept him as their parliamentary leader. Then he went on to state, in accordance with constitutional practice in the United Kingdom, the National Liberation Movement and its allies will expect Your Excellency to call upon Dr. K. A. Busia, their parliamentary leader, to form a government, should they, together with the independents support them, win more than 52 seats at the election. By the time this appeared in the newspapers on the 18th of July, it was already apparent from the results so far declared that the opposition had lost the election. Never can a tactical move have rebounded so woefully upon its initiators. "Well," I exclaimed to a small gathering of party members who were seated around me on the veranda, "have you read this? It is good news. It is as I have always said. These people are really with us all the time, if they would only admit it." "How do you mean, Kwame?" somebody asked. "Well, read it yourself. Dr. Buzia says he is prepared to form a government with anything over 52 members. That means that he has recognized the fact that a simple, overall majority, even of 1 seat, mind you, constitutes a democratic verdict." There were loud cheers. "If he is sincere," I continued, "we have nothing more to worry about. It will be plain sailing from now on, for we are all talking the same language, at last." As it turned out, the CPP won 71 seats, increased later by the support of one of the independents, which gave us a majority of 40 in the Legislative Assembly of 104. This was surely more than sufficient to meet the requirements of the Secretary of State that we should have a reasonable majority. Though my party lost some seats in Ashanti, it made gains elsewhere, and its support was so distributed throughout the country as a whole that quite apart from our large parliamentary representation, we could claim to be the only party to be able to speak in a national sense. We won every seat in the 2 regions of the colony and the Accra municipality, obtaining 82% of the total votes cast. In Transvolta Togoland, we won 8 seats out of 13 and also polled a clear majority of the total votes. In the Northern Territories, we won 11 seats out of 26, increasing our representation from there, but losing, unfortunately, my former Minister of Health, Mr. Imoru Igala. Even in Ashanti, where the NLM had anticipated an absolute victory, we won 8 of the 21 seats, and with 43% of the total votes cast, we actually increased our poll as compared with the previous election. The following day, I was invited by the governor to form a government. Having lost 2 of my former ministers in the election, and because of the resignation of the Minister of Trade and Labour, Mr. E.O. Asafu Ajay, it took 3 days before I was satisfied that the men I had selected were the right ones for the task that lay ahead of us. In particular, I tried to choose my ministers to some extent according to the regions. Eventually, the names I selected were as follows: A. Casely Hayford as Minister of Communications, Kojo Botsio as Minister of Trade and Labour, K. A. Bedema as Minister of Finance, A. E. Nkumsa as Minister of Housing, A. E. A. Afori Atta as Minister of Local Government, J. H. Alassani as Minister of Health, Ako Ajay as Minister of the Interior, N. A. Welbeck as Minister of Works, J. B. Urzua as Minister of Education, B. Yeboah Afari as Minister of Agriculture, Krobo Edusai as Minister without Portfolio, and finally L. R. Abavana as Minister also without Portfolio. Kofi Bako was once again my ministerial secretary and the government chief whip. There was no doubt that we had won the election with a clear majority, but even these indisputable figures did not satisfy the opposition. As soon as the final position was known, Dr. Buzia called a press conference in Kumasi and made the astonishing announcement that the election results had established the case of the opposition for a federal form of government. He acknowledged the fact that the election had been fought on this issue, but he maintained that because the CPP had not won overall majorities in Ashanti and in the Northern Territories, this proved the need for federalism. He sought to support this extraordinary case by inventing a further region, which he called the southern part of the Trust Territory of Togoland. Of the 6 seats forming this area, he said the CPP had only won 3, which according to his theory showed that the people there were not in favor of a unitary constitution. He had to admit that the colony was overwhelmingly in favor of the CPP, but in spite of this, he concluded by saying the picture quite clearly resolves the constitutional dispute in favor of those who advocate a federal form of government. On the day of the formal opening of the assembly, the opposition benches were completely deserted. As the time drew near for the arrival of the governor, those on the government benches became restless and concerned. Surely the opposition were not going to boycott the assembly on today of all days, somebody asked me. I shrugged my shoulders. But, said another in disgust, such behavior is contemptuous of the dignity and authority of the Legislative Assembly and the democratic institutions vested in it. Not only that, interrupted another, It is an insult to His Excellency and through him to the Queen of England. There was sudden silence as the governor's ADC announced to the House the arrival of His Excellency. Shortly before the governor had finished his speech from the throne, two opposition members from Togoland arrived, but they were the only ones on the opposition benches who were present during the whole of the proceedings. Perhaps the opposition realized later that such behavior was hardly likely to commend them to the government in Great Britain as statesmanlike and responsible politicians. At any rate, they issued a statement to explain the reasons for the absence of the opposition. It appeared that they had held a meeting that morning, and by the time they reached the assembly, the crowd there was so dense that the police would not let them take their cars through. A policeman, the statement said, had suggested that they could get out and walk, but they were afraid to do so as they had been given a rough reception by the crowd on the previous day when members had been formally sworn in. Apparently they had been booing by part of the crowd, mostly from a number of market women. The highlight of the governor's speech was the statement that the government would that week introduce a motion calling on the British government to pass a bill declaring the Gold Coast a sovereign and independent state within the Commonwealth. The following day, the opposition tabled an amendment criticizing this proposal on the grounds that it was premature until a further effort had been made to produce what they called an agreed constitution. Until action had been taken on the publication of the Commission's report regarding the affairs of the Cocoa Purchasing Company and until action had been taken against what they alleged was widespread corruption in public corporations. In their speeches which followed, the opposition gave no evidence in support of these allegations, and the Assembly rejected the amendment by a majority of 37. The evening following this defeat, the opposition issued yet another statement to the press, saying that they would not attend the assembly when the independence motion came before the House. I deeply regretted this attitude, which was so unbecoming to the dignity of the assembly and such an ugly blot on the record of our country's struggle to independent nationhood. This moment was the culmination of hard years of effort during which so many of our people had sacrificed selflessly for our cause. It was a moment of tremendous drama when all should have experienced a profound sense of history and of dedication for themselves afresh to the cause. In my speech introducing the motion for independence, I tried to express something of the momentousness of the occasion, and although I was bound to deal in detail with the challenge which the opposition had made, I tried to avoid the rancor and to lift the question to a national level above the conflict of party politics. At the same time, I had to remember that my speech was, in effect, the statement of my government's case in support of the motion. After recalling once more the suffering and sacrifice which we had endured on the road to independence, I went on to remind the House that when the Assembly approved my motion for the adoption of the White Paper containing constitutional proposals for an independent Gold Coast on the 22nd of May 1956, the country was, even at that time, ready to take over its own affairs. However, even as we were moving into those final stages, there arose in the country a point of view, advocated with a persistence which, I said, I feel frequently when outside the bounds of legitimate political activity, that our future constitutional development should be upon the basis of a federal instead of a unitary form of government. I pointed out that the government did everything possible to resolve these differences, but when all failed, the Secretary of State expressed his view that independence could be achieved only by demonstrating to the world that we had a full and free opportunity to consider our Constitution and to express our view on it in a general election. The Secretary of State, I went on, then gave this pledge. If a general election is held, Her Majesty's government will be ready to accept a motion calling for independence from within the Commonwealth passed by a reasonable majority in the newly elected legislature and then to declare a firm date for attainment of their purpose. The general election had been held, the results were known, and it was my view that there was nothing to prevent us now from fulfilling the final conditions of the Secretary of State's statement. There was also no reason why the Secretary of State, in his turn, should feel any reluctance to fulfill his pledge. I then dealt in detail with the opposition's desire to partition the country into a small number of autonomous regions. Such a prospect, I said, in the conditions of the modern world is too unreal to contemplate. In any event, this case had been put to the country in the recent election and had been rejected. There is no shame in electoral defeat, I continued. Shame lies only in being a bad loser. And I added that to allow the minority to override the decision of the majority would be to make a farce of parliamentary government. I had always been ready to recognize, I went on, as had been put forward in the government's constitutional proposals last May, that there should be a measure of devolution of powers from the central government to the regions. I confirmed that the proposals contained in Sir Frederick Bourne's report on the subject, as modified by the Achimota Conference, were generally acceptable to the government. But, I emphasized, the government considers that it would be impractical and in fact indeed dangerous for this country to try to proceed further than that along the road to federalism. I went on to point out that the House I went on to point out to the House the immense burden of administration that federation would impose on our small country, and to consider whether, with our present manifold problems, we should consider and actually shouldering such a increased burden. How are we meant to finance such a lavish structure of government? I asked. Are we to sacrifice the welfare of the masses of our people to multiple government for its own sake? Are our people only now beginning to struggle painfully out of dismal want, to be pushed back to support an administrative structure so cumbersome and eating so heavily into our financial resources that there will be nothing left for it to administer? I repeated what I had said in the House in August of the previous year, that my determination was that we should attain independence with as workable and as simple a system of government as we could devise. In this way I came to the heart of the motion. What I am now formally asking the people of the Gold Coast is to request from the United Kingdom government the fulfillment of our national aspiration for independence. We are ready to assume the responsibility, the heavy responsibility, and the right to order our own affairs and to decide our own destiny as citizens of a sovereign and independent state. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that there is none here whose heart beats so faint that he will refuse to join in this grand purpose. Let me make this quite clear. It will require the help and hard work and loyalty of every man, woman, and child in this country to make a success of our essay into independent nationhood. We should realize this, and having done so, let us realize also that we cannot afford to fail. We have the pledge of the Secretary of State that if a motion calling for independence within the Commonwealth is passed by a reasonable majority in a newly elected legislature, he will declare a firm date for the attainment of this purpose. Mr. Speaker, the newly elected legislature referred to by the Secretary of State in his pledge is now assembled here, and we are the members. All we have to do this day is to pass by a reasonable majority the motion before us, and then the United Kingdom government will declare a firm date for our independence. From the results of our recent general election, responsible opinion throughout the world has affirmed that we already have this reasonable majority here and now in this assembly, but we must declare our decision ourselves before all of the world. Truly has it been said that once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. The Gold Coast people, the British government, nay, the whole world, are waiting this day to hear our decision. Which is it to be? For my part, my stand is clear. I am determined to serve my country to the end and to give her the best service of which I am capable. I am determined in so doing to see that nothing stands between the people of this country and the attainment of independence. I am equally determined to ensure that a firm date for independence is announced without delay. I vote for independence and I humbly ask honourable members to do the same. The cheer that arose from all parts of the House at the conclusion of my speech was, I felt, the authentic voice of the people. Those who understood the triumphant nature of the occasion and whose hearts soared with happiness and pride as they realized that we were already crossing the threshold of victory. It was a pity that members of the opposition had not found it in their hearts to take part on such an historic occasion. But still determined to try and throw cold water on our success, Dr. Bussier and his supporters declared that the struggle for them was no longer centered in the Gold Coast, but in London. They at once set about preparing a delegation to go to Britain. Dr. Bussier, official leader of the opposition, announced that he was leaving the country to undertake a lecture tour in Europe, to which he had previously committed himself. He later led the opposition delegation to the British government, even when the influential Manchester Guardian published an editorial warning him of the futility and irresponsibility of his mission. He failed to see the way the wind was blowing against him. The Conservative Daily Telegraph gave no less than 13 inches of space to a statement he made, appealing to the British government not to grant independence because the country was not ready for parliamentary democracy. We still need you. We still need the British in the Gold Coast, he stated. Your experiment there is not yet complete. Sometimes I wonder why you seem in such a hurry to wash your hands of us. The Secretary of State, when he met the opposition leaders in London, felt that he had been able to persuade them to take a more reasonable view of the Gold Coast's constitutional problems. But it is unfortunate that there seemed to be a great difference between what was being said in London and what was being publicly declared in the Gold Coast, because at the same time as the leader of the opposition and his supporters in London and their agitation against the granting of independence were praising the beneficial rule of the British in the Gold Coast, the other section of their followers in the Gold Coast were calling for the removal of the governor. It is equally unfortunate that certain leading journals of opinion in the United Kingdom continued to support and encourage misunderstandings by publishing criticisms of my government's conduct without fully understanding the implication of the political situation facing our country. There can be few, if any, governments in the world who have exercised so much tolerance and devoted so much valuable time to considering the whims of such an uncooperative minority as my government did during these years.